Okay, so to me, this is the important point of this, or one of the important points, which is what is the theoretical framework? What is the when you're positing that something's causally related, not just, somehow related, perhaps because of another third variable or whatever. So you're saying that there's a causal relationship between these two variables. It's you don't always have to, but it's nice to have a theoretical mechanism and to make the claim that this is a plausible evolutionary account of why fertility would decline. Now, he does attempt to do that, vaguely at least, by pointing to some of these studies in other animals. But the studies in other animals generally find that what happens is when the female's estrus shuts down because of stress hormones, essentially. So as population, and say, I don't know, I'm making this up, but let's just say squirrel population becomes incredibly dense, which leads to uh, a massive increase in competition for resources and a massive increase in, let's say, cortisol or something, which literally shuts down the female's ability to have offspring. That does not seem to be the case in humans. So far as we know, you don't actually lose the ability to have children if you live in an apartment, right?
Right. Yeah. My understanding is that most females living in urban areas of Western countries are still able to conceive. They
Right.
choose not to,
Right.
or
So if
choose to do so at lower rates than their counterparts in outside of cities.
And one might even make the prediction that if somebody living in these dense, if a woman living in these dense areas were to marry and not use birth control, she would soon have at least become pregnant. Whether she brought that to birth or not is a
Yeah.
different story. So,
One
so
assumes that's the case. I mean, maybe you could find that the infertility rate is slightly higher in urban areas due to stress or pollution, but I can't imagine you would find a very large relationship.
agreed. And if you did find that relationship, that would certainly be interesting, right?
Yeah.
I think that would be important. That is not in this article.
No.
Um, so I was trying to think through, and I don't know, what do you think the Steelman of the best actual causal variable is in this claim? Like, what is it that's causing the reduction in fertility, at least hypothetically?
Yeah, he doesn't go into this, although he may have done elsewhere because I haven't followed every tweet
Yes,
he's written about this
right.
subject, and he is quite a prolific tweeter about these subjects. I guess you could argue that even if living at high density doesn't literally make females temporarily infertile, it uh, sets in motion psychological mechanisms which cause people to become less optimistic about childbearing and to want to delay it. For just to speculate, you're a person that lives in a city, and you every day you go to work on the metro, and you're stuffed into a very cramped metro carriage on the way to work, and you have to wait in line in a long queue to get your lunch, and these signals all tell you childbearing would be too expensive. The resources are too scarce. Even though the resources are not physically scarce, it's a kind of evolutionary misfiring, perhaps, of a tendency to become less enthusiastic about childbearing when there are very many other people around. For example, just in the same way, people become, sexually aroused by looking at pornography, even though they can't impregnate a photograph or
Right.
video on their screen. It's an evolutionary misfiring of the tendency to be aroused by the sight of a beautiful naked woman.
One would have to posit some sort of genetic mechanism here, though. One would have to argue that it's actually in the gene's fitness interest to shut down fertility temporarily, at least in high density areas, right? That would be the claim, and that this was advantageous across evolutionary history, or that some more attenuated version of it was adaptive, and that, as you say, it's sort of like a mismatch between human psychology and cities. But it seems to me that if we look at, can't we rule that out, or at least call that into question by looking at the fertility of highly dense areas in, say, the 1940s or even the 1880s? So, for example, there's a Simon Streeter, I think is how you say it, and Anne Hardy estimate of the fertility in London from 1871 to 1880. And I think they found the fertility was what was it, 4.4 or 5, let's
Yeah, I
say.
think it was 4.4. And that was
Okay,
the number of live births to women born in that period of time in London,
right.
and
And
contrasted with the fertility of the country as a whole, which was 4.5. So
okay,
essentially the
right.
same.
Yeah. So basically, statistically, there was no difference between the fertility in London at that time, which was quite a dense area, and all of England. So
Very
it
dense, I would assume it. I mean, it's known to have uh, prompted huge concerns over overcrowding in slums, for example.
pollution, reading Charles Dickens
Yeah,
novels, for example.
exactly. As
Yeah.
as detailed with great flair by Mr. Dickens.
Yes. Yeah, so that would call that into question. And I don't know. I mean, I'd have to think about this more thoroughly, but it doesn't seem to me like a an evolutionarily plausible hypothesis for a variety of reasons. Is there a different explanation that would be plausible if this one isn't? Is there something about maybe modern cities and density? I mean,
Yeah,
could
you
you
would basically have to find a factor which was present in modern cities that wasn't
right,
present in cities in the 19th century. I mean, when I was digging around in the literature, I was only able to find that one paper that you mentioned,
right,
um, on fertility in the 19th century city. Perhaps unsurprisingly, as records were much less comprehensive back then. Perhaps England had better than average records. But certainly England was one of the earliest countries in the West to develop economically, so it would stand to reason that its record keeping would have been better at that time. So, but I presume that fertility in, Rome, Paris, Berlin was similarly high, or perhaps slightly lower, but well above replacement level. And presumably, as you point out, the mechanism that I outlined would have applied just as much back then as it does now. You go out, you have to wait 20 minutes for your horse and carriage because there are so many people taking up the streets, and when you go into the shop to buy your groceries, there's a long queue. You have many signals telling you this is a highly dense area. There's intense competition for resources. Another one minor caveat with that paper is that they were looking at marital fertility because births within marriage were recorded differently to births outside of marriage because there was obviously a huge taboo
yeah, yeah, that's right,
on illegitimate childbearing at the time, and there was a
right.
lot of social stigma attached to it, as as novels by the likes of Jane Austen make very clear. So perhaps London had much lower rates of illegitimate childbearing. I don't.
Hard to believe that.
It doesn't
I think
seem
you
very
would
plausible.
predict the opposite.
You might even predict the opposite, yeah.
Yes.
And the authors, in any case, claim that levels of illegitimate childbearing were very low in England at the time, thanks to the social stigma I just mentioned, presumably.
Yeah. And I think an important point about this proposed evolutionary mechanism is that presumably the important thing would actually be competition for resources. That is, like, you're using the population density as a cue that resources there is a dearth of resources, and perhaps having children would be a bad idea. But if if that were true, I mean, it's useful to note that many of these people in these dense areas are in fact reasonably affluent.
Very.
They are not on the verge of suffering or competing with, like, the apartment across the hall for the last food for the week, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, it would have to be the case that for some reason evolution had favored a fertility, favored density as a fertility Q, or sorry, as a Q for level of resources that in turn
Right.
influence fertility over all sorts of other potential cues that one might have assumed would be more powerful, such as availability of food, availability of shelter,
Yes.
warmth,
Right.